Fraud is a growing issue, has impacted almost every business in the UK. Charities are therefore no different and will often be seen as easier targets than some larger private sector businesses. It's almost impossible to give an accurate number relating to the cost of fraud in the charity sector, mainly because fraud is either not always spotted or not always reported. The 2016 Annual Fraud Indicator, published by Portsmouth University in conjunction with the accounting firm PKF Littlejohn, estimated that the charity sector suffered approximately £1.9 billion worth of fraud every year. Equally, there are differences of opinion as to how much fraud is committed by members of staff against their own charity. KPMG reported that up to 50% of frauds are committed by someone on the inside, while a report published by the Charity Finance Group over the same period stated that internal fraud committed by staff and volunteers amounted to about 1/3 of all frauds experienced by charities. Whichever view you choose to agree with, the facts are clear. Fraud is a real threat. Your charity is no different to any other business as far as a fraudster is concerned, and it is inevitable that your charity will experience fraud in one way or another. The purpose of this webinar is to focus on the internal fraud risks that exist and what charities can do to mitigate them. Charities rely on the good reputations and enjoy high levels of public trust and confidence. Equally, charities are often reliant on volunteers and the goodwill of its staff members. With potentially less funds and resources to invest in internal systems, screening checks, back office processes, etc., charities are a prime target for fraudsters. While cybercrime continues to rise when considering fraud risk, we need to recognise that people are the potential weak link, but also the strongest defence. No one likes to imagine that a colleague at the next desk or the volunteer working in your shop might be a fraudster, but career fraudsters often deliberately seek out positions inside charities precisely so they can exploit the weak controls and over-reliance on trust they expect to find there. And while most employees would never think of it, the temptations of easy access and lax controls can sometimes prove too much even for a previously honest person to avoid. Individual acts of staff dishonesty can range from lying on a CV to get a job, or from a high-value fraud committed by one or more employees or volunteers already on the inside. Often the target is money, but equally customer data is of significant value. Accessing personal information of donors is a big focus for fraud. Finding this data has been stolen and sold on or used for other purposes is not only embarrassing but could lead to regulatory fines. The overall financial cost of an internal fraud are often underestimated. The financial loss from an internal fraud can heavily increase the burden on fundraising and expenditure, but that isn't the full extent of the cost. Costs only escalate once a fraud has been discovered. For example, there are potential costs of disciplinary processes, investigation costs, recruitment of replacement staff, as well as the potential regulatory penalties that someone might suffer. So the true cost of fraud is often much, much more. But that isn't all. Your charity's reputation is vital, and the damage an internal fraud can cause to that brand is immeasurable, not to mention the effect it would have on morale. Therefore, prevention is most cost-effective way and the best cure. While prevention is partly about controls and screening, it's also about understanding the individuals you employ and being open about fraud risk so that everyone can recognise the warning signs. Common red flags include sudden and unexplained lifestyle changes, signs that someone is living beyond their means, for example, or reluctance to take a holiday or taking too many holidays. None of these alone is evidence of fraud. There can be legitimate explanations for all of them, but they do indicate a need to investigate further. Desperation, personal crisis, a disgruntlement, a mispromotion, for example, are both common motives for fraud. So treating your staff well, including support for anyone in financial difficulty or who has a drug or alcohol problem, can be a really good way of preventing fraud. What's interesting is how these frauds come to light. Most frauds are detected by having good controls and practices in place. Almost 50% of frauds reported to Cifas were detected and dealt with in this exact way. However, fraud is identified in other ways, and it's embarrassing to have your donors report fraud before you can spot it. But actually this makes up the second highest reason why fraud is detected. The key must be to build the right tools, skills and resources to help spot and detect, and wherever possible help mitigate against the growing risk.
We need to develop a plan on how we can manage the risk of fraud, simply because fraud can occur in many ways. I will talk about basic, and I believe key concepts that all charities, large or small, need to take into consideration in developing their fraud mitigation plan. One of the first things to consider is whether you have the right tone at the top, and how you demonstrate that to your employees and stakeholders. This means that we should show our commitment to tackle fraud and communicate this appropriately. Having relevant governing documents like the Code of Conduct, a fraud policy, and strategy helps us to have a common understanding. I will next speak about a few things we could do to prevent, detect, respond, and deter fraud. Charities should assess whether their processes adequately mitigate the risk of fraud. It is essential that we conduct risk assessments to identify our areas of vulnerability and develop appropriate controls to mitigate the risks identified. Benchmarking with other charities of similar sizes could reveal to us areas we can improve on. This process of assessment should be continuous. Early detection of fraud is important not only because it saves the charity from further losses, but it also demonstrates that the systems and processes instituted are working effectively. We should ensure that staff know how to report, where to report, and that they will be safe when they report fraud suspicions. Proactive reviews of processes also help deter fraud by increasing the perception of detection. Responding to fraud when you're not prepared to can be a very daunting experience. A poor response can create more risks and water down your prevention, deterrence, and detection efforts. We should therefore have a response plan in place. Having a response plan helps us manage suspicions consistently, efficiently, and in a cost-effective way. Sometimes, when responding to a fraud suspicion, you may find that there are several stakeholders who may need to be kept updated of the incident. In such cases, a communication plan will be useful in your response. In addition, within the response, there should be readiness to sanction and pursue redress. Pursuing redress can be costly, but it greatly deters. Always remember that a good response mirrors management's fraud tolerance thresholds. We cannot fight fraud in silos. We need to build the capability and capacity of all our staff to effectively play their part. Likewise, charities should not operate in silos. It is useful to be part of groups already formed, like Charities Against Fraud or any other you might have, and share knowledge on how to tackle fraud. Fraud evolves, and we must therefore continually keep ourselves updated to improve our own resilience. In summary, we can mitigate the risk of fraud by having the right tone at the top and putting in place measures to prevent it, detect it, to respond to it, and working with the honest majority within and without our organization to deter fraud.